and the budget next year has to be an honest conversation with the people of Pakistan. When I say an honest conversation, I mean that we need to tell the people of Pakistan how broken the budget estimates actually are. Let me give you an example of that. This year, when Pakistan pays its one head only in the expenditure side, which is our markup, which will be nearly 5,300 billion rupees, most of the net federal income would be consumed. All other expenditures, defense, pensions, running of the civil government, subsidies, grants will all be financed through debt. Next year, we are looking at a similar scenario. So both our expenditure side as well as our taxation side is broken. Look at the taxation side. FPR's tax to GDP ratio is hovering at around 8.5%. It's the same level that we achieved in 2011. Since then, we've not been able to make any substantive dent in direct taxation or increasing substantively our tax to GDP ratio. The repair must start on the expenditure side. What do I mean by that? Show us a reform of the subsidies, targeting of the subsidies to only the people who deserve, not the people who are getting these concessions, who are getting these tax exemptions to the tune of 1,500 to 2,000 billion rupees. Then on the expenditure side, we need to see the reform of the development budget. Our development throw forward is 1,300 billion rupees. Our development spending is hovering around 700 to 900 billion rupees. We must not be doing the projects which are provincial in nature. And that brings me to a very, very important expenditure reform I want to see in the budget. I want to see that the provincial subjects, which are still being done by the federal government, which have already gone to the provinces after the 18th amendment, should not be funded by the federal government. What are these subjects? The social sector, zakat and ushur, population, education, health, climate. Savings from the current expenditure as well as the development expenditure could range anywhere between 3 to 400 billion rupees. Then we want to see a reform on the debt reprofiling, on the public financial management to save us from the 7,500 billion rupee bill, which we will only get on the expenditure side in the interest payment next year. These are all untenable figures. So a very thorough reform on the expenditure side. At the same time, what I want to see is a reform on the taxation side. We cannot live a life in Pakistan without improving domestic resource mobilization. Otherwise, our dependence on a debt-fueled economy would always continue. So you cannot have sectors which are highly underpaying what they deserve to pay. For example, the retail and the wholesale sector. The potential to gain is much higher than where we stand today on the income tax. Also, the agriculture income tax has not been done in the country properly, quoting that this is a provincial subject. It is fine even if it's a provincial subject. If we were to tax it at half the rate of what we tax urban income, there is potential of over 300 billion rupees. Then the most important sector that we have given incentive to rather than taxing it, and that incentive has taken investment from productive sectors to the real estate sector. Capital gains tax, tax on immovable property, capital value tax. These are really, really large areas, and they can not only benefit the federal taxation but the provincial taxation. So it is for us to decide what we want to do. Pakistan's tax gap today stands at about minimum 30%. What I mean by that is that next year we are going to set a target of 9,000 to 9,500 billion rupees in taxation at the federal level. If we were to reach this 30%, the minimum tax gap of Pakistan, we should be collecting over 12,000 billion rupees. If we were to do that, and if we were to make some expenditure changes, Pakistan's fiscal deficit at a structural level would fall to anywhere near 5% or under 5%. And that's what I want to see in the next budget. My thoughts on what the budget 24 should look like are very clear. We should come clean with the people that we have been subsidizing those sectors which need to pay the proper amount of tax that is due to them. So the tax exemptions, the tax concessions on key sectors must be seen to go away, and the elite of the country who seem to have captured the taxation system should pay their due share, whether that's on capital gains, whether that's on inheritance tax, whether that's on monies they put in the bank, and other areas should all be taxed at the similar rate. These are really progressive income tax ideas that Pakistan needs to put together. We have decided not to tax rent or interest or dividend with progressive income taxation structure. We must do that. Then, which I always say is what the marginal income tax rate of a person is. Then we must raise the direct taxes, the contribution to overall taxation, which right now stands at only about 30%. Pakistan's retailers, the real estate, the agriculture must pay their due share. What I also want to see from the government side is the realization that tax compliance and enforcement remains two of the weakest areas handled by the Federal Board of Revenue. They must leverage the data sets that they have, and good data sets at NADRA, as well as Pakistan Revenue Automation Authority within the FBR. And they must do on a regular basis data mining to come up with high taxpayers who are not paying their share. They must also do serious tax gap analysis, which means what is the kind of value added tax, what is the kind of corporate income tax, what is the kind of personal income tax that should be collected, so they would know the real tax gap that exists. I also want to see digitization and increase of new technologies which can further increase compliance but really reduce the burden on the taxpayer of filing taxes, so they can do it seamlessly. They can believe that there is no other person on the other side, but it is a frictionless taxation system in which we are working. Embracing the technological revolution to automate routine processes can free the FBR staff also to do really thinking policy work. Budget 24 should focus on this so that ease of filing taxation can bring in the formal sector into the informal sector. But I always say the expenditure side has a lot to offer. I want the authorities to change their mindset that expenditures in Pakistan are inelastic. The SOEs, the energy sector, are in need of serious privatization, both causing fiscal and quasi-fiscal damage or losses or bleeding to the exchequer. The contingent liabilities that we carry on our budget. So I want to see a way forward on the SOEs in particular, as well as the energy sector, so that the bleeding in the coming years comes down. We are running a quasi-fiscal deficit of 2,600 billion in power, 16 to 1,800 billion in the energy sector, and a huge amount in the food sector. We must come clean and do the reform of these state-owned enterprises. Another area very close to my heart is the pension reform of Pakistan. I used to sit on the table in the Q block and always put my thoughts forward and say pensions running at 250 billion 6 years ago would almost double in 5 years. I was not entirely correct. They have actually more than doubled to 600 billion today. That is not a tenable position. If I involve the provincial pensions, I think we are at 1300 billion rupees. That's an enormous amount. We must move to pay as you go regime in the country. We must freeze new recruitments and we must do away with the vacancies which stand unfilled today. These are serious times and these should be taken very seriously. On the development side, I've always said that don't do the projects which are due to the provinces. All the areas which have been given to the provinces, health, education, let them do that. Don't build the roads within the small areas. And then start thinking that Pakistan is now in need of soft infrastructure. So a real reform on the development side is also something that I would like to see. In the coming years, Pakistan can really repair the fiscal deficit to under 5%. This will have enormous good effect on the economy. Not only would you be able to curtail the growth of debt to GDP, you will also be able to handle the current account. Always remember, when I see the movement of Pakistan's fiscal and the current account deficit, when I go back 3 decades, I see a close correlation between the two. The mother of all ills is your fiscal deficit. Bring it to sustainable levels and you would see that the current account deficit of Pakistan would also fall to levels around 1.5% of GDP, which are easily financeable by the government. Lastly, for the people of Pakistan, what I want to see is a responsible budget which brings down inflation. Fiscal deficit is also a root cause of higher inflation in the country. Lastly, I want to see a couple of things. I want to see the inflation control, but I want to see real relief in terms of putting money into the pockets of the 10 million households who are vulnerable in the country, and our income support program has their data. I think the 350 odd billion rupees that we put in the income support program should go to at least 500 or 600 billion rupees. I think the pensions and the wages of the public sector should increase by a responsible amount of 15 to 20%. I would also like to see that the minimum wage should be increased to minimum around 30 to 32,000, depending on how the government has done work on this and sees what is the cost of living allowance that is due, so that we can increase the minimum wage. And lastly, I would say, if the government does all these things, there should be persuasion enough for the private sector to follow suit in terms of giving relief to those people. I think if we can do part of what I'm explaining, then the budget repair would continue into the future, and the incoming government would not only do all this repair, but would also be looking at redoing the new NFC and seeing what provinces can contribute in terms of income support program, poverty reduction programs, food security programs, because the burden now has to be borne equally by the 5 governments in the country.